And apparently, as I understand it, Pavel is ready to keep taking such losses?
Well, obviously, yes. Where did these numbers come from? It's hard for me to imagine. November 15th or December 15th, Kupiansk by the end of the year. What's that supposed to mean? It means that Gerasimov made yet another promise to Putin. If it was 2 months ago, he told him that they had already captured Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. This time he says they've already surrounded them. And now, having lied for a second time, he now needs somehow to figure out what to do. To prove to Putin that he's not just all talk. And that's why he'll throw all possible forces at Pokrovsk first and foremost. The capture of the Pokrovsk agglomeration just to fulfill at least the first promise. And for this, enormous forces have been concentrated in the Pokrovsk direction. Why specifically the promised Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad? That's also clear. Because even though the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration had military strategic significance as a logistics center for our forces defending in the east, that significance has been lost, as somewhere after the Russians broke through to the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway. Nevertheless, this covers the flank of our entire defense on the Kostiantynivka-Dobropilya direction. That very Dobropilya salient of the Russian 51st Army, which they tried to establish and which our brigades are now eliminating. This can be considered something of a false start when they decided to bite off more than they could chew, trying to both encircle Pokrovsk and move into the rear of the Kostiantynivka group of forces at the same time. In other words, their current objective to break our front in Donbass is to capture Pokrovsk and Venrorad. Without this, it will be extremely difficult to achieve their objective. The situation at the Dobropilya salient is a vivid confirmation of this. That's why massive Russian forces have been concentrated around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, trying to capture Pokrovsk at any cost, first and foremost. They are pressing on Pokrovsk from the south, while the 51st Army is also trying to encircle it from the north. Even further north of the 51st Army, our units and formations are pressing, eliminating the Dobropilya salient. Then here, as they say, it's a matter of who acts faster. On the one hand. On the other hand, the specific nature and characteristics of the actions that are currently ongoing and taking place directly within Pokrovsk will be determined by the command and control of the forces. Because these scattered and fragmented, dispersed, and relatively small groups will only truly be effective or successful when they are properly covered and protected by an umbrella of command and communications, when they act in accordance with and strictly follow a single unified plan that has been established and agreed upon in advance. And here, whoever technologically outmaneuvers the other will win. This is exactly what General Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, meant, who was explaining the situation in the Pokrovsk direction.
Which the Russians don't have, right? As blunt as it may sound. Again, recalling Syrsky, in one of his latest posts on Telegram, he wrote that the situation in the Zaporizhzhia region is very difficult, and in some directions, specifically the Alexandrovsk and Huliaipol directions, Syrsky said. He said that the enemy is much larger, and during fierce fighting, the enemy advanced and captured 3 settlements. This is in fact an admission that yes, Ukraine has temporarily lost these settlements. So this is what I want to convey, something the Russian Federation does not have. This is the truth about the situation at the front. If there is progress by Ukraine somewhere, it is reported. But if the situation worsens somewhere, that is also spoken about openly. By the words of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. About the Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russians have become more active there. For what reason? The Zaporizhzhia direction is here. Why do the Russian occupiers need this, knowing that sooner or later it's still a steppe zone and Ukraine has the advantage there, since it has fire control?
The thing is, when Gerasimov spoke about an offensive in the south, for some reason we all assumed that this offensive would be in the south to north direction. From south to north, in reality, the enemy's offensive in the south is not that at all. This is the development of the situation in the Krakow direction, Remember the Kurakov direction, then the Novopavlivka direction. Now we're already talking about the Huliepol direction. In other words, by moving from east to west, the enemy is actually flanking our defensive lines. Why are they succeeding at this? Because the stationary defensive lines were carefully constructed to defend in the north-south direction. The offensive is happening on the flank and in some areas even in the rear in the direction of Oleksandrivka as well, and this significantly complicates the defense for our forces. Therefore, it's not entirely accurate to say that the enemy has become more active. If you look at the statistical reports from the American Institute for the Study of War from 2 or even 3 weeks ago, they identified the Novopavlivka sector as the section of the front where the Russians are most effective in terms of the ratio of forces used to results achieved, even surpassing the combat outcomes in the Pokrovsk area. The Pokrovsk direction is key. The south is still a secondary direction for now, but as a result, the Russians may potentially be able to successfully achieve their stated objectives, which they have set out to accomplish with fewer forces than on the main axis of attack. And regarding the Zaporizhia direction, it is one of the key, most important areas. Critically important. The experts have said this in previous weeks and continue to say it now. There's another point here. For the Russians to succeed in the east, they need to concentrate their forces on the main axis of attack, while our forces need to be stretched as much as possible along the front. From the Zaporizhia direction all the way to the Kharkiv direction, where the enemy is becoming more active. I'm not even talking about the Kupiansk salient, which is also a political matter for Gerasimov, and to the north in the northern part of Kharkiv region. They want to stretch our reserves so that we are unable to effectively concentrate on those lines that are extremely important for them to report to Putin. And as a result, their losses are not any less. And the main plan of Ukraine's defense forces is to wear down the enemy's offensive potential. Why did Gerasimov's summer campaign fail? Essentially, from the Russian point of view, they failed the summer campaign because the resources that were allocated for the strategic offensive operation, they unfortunately did not meet the necessary timing, and as a result, they ended up exhausting their available resources without actually achieving their intended objectives. Our task now is roughly similar, though not identical. To the maximum extent possible, to weaken the enemy's offensive potential, because in a week, 2 or 3, when they might be on the verge of achieving their goals, they'll find themselves without any resources left. That's it. They're out of shells, out of people.
Pavel, I want to add something else. We have about 2 minutes left. You know, before we were technically able to talk to you, we prepared several materials, a few key points that we voiced about how the Russian occupiers operate, and in several instances, yes, including that video that was recently circulating on social media, which many people have seen. Some are on foot, some on makeshift carts, some on motorcycles. This is how the Russians are approaching and moving closer to the city. And now, as we were sharing new information, the word fog kept coming up everywhere. So I wanted to ask about the fog, because it seems that the occupiers are sometimes able to use it very effectively, judging by the results. From a military perspective, can you explain how... That's my question. How does fog actually affect certain movements? What can the military do in the fog? Right now, I just want to ask in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be...
About something specific. Fog has helped us a lot, too. Go ahead, yes, please. We were able to carry out a partial rotation and evacuate the wounded from Pokrovsk Mirnorad. This was thanks to the incredible work of our drone operators because of the fog, but also thanks to the fog itself, which made it difficult for the enemy's drones to operate. By the way, those columns that the RGZ channel showed them sneaking quietly and carefully through the area on ATVs and scooters, moving with caution. In the city of Pokrovsk, our brave defenders have already shown in detail what happened to those individuals afterwards. The fog, physical and geographical conditions, they always affect the nature of combat operations. You have to adapt. The fog, bad weather, wind, they make it harder for drones to operate, especially FPV drones. And right now, these are the main eyes of the army, the hands of the army, and the primary means of striking the enemy.